Humanitarian refugee migration. I know one of you at least are doing that. Okay, it's a very fluid topic. The numbers change, but we're talking about the general trends, and I'm going to be talking a lot about forced migration, displaced migration, but also I'm going to just backtrack a bit and go through some of the terms we didn't go through earlier, which is assimilation, integration and multicultural, just to be sure that we're all on the same page for them. So if you wonder why it's stuck in the end of this lecture, I found it to be the best place, so that's where it's going. Number of internally displaced persons globally has obviously been on the rise in the 90s, 2000s, and as you can see, these figures I graphed up to 2013, and as I say, figures change so rapidly then I often have to go to other sources. I haven't had time to upgrade that. So this is a very good website. Don't know if you actually visit it. There's an essay going to be set around a similar topic for anybody interested in those essays. I expect you to go and search some of your own material. So this is the United Nations website for refugees, basically, and it's got some good statistical yearbooks where you can get global trends over time. So it's claiming, and there's been a big increase, that 65.3 million forcibly displaced people worldwide in 2015-16. 21.3 million are classified as refugees, and 16 million of those under the United Nations mandate. 5.2 million Palestinian refugees registered elsewhere, but clearly all classified under the definition of a refugee, which I'll go through in a minute. Stateless people, 10 million. Now, this is the definition that we must be familiar with because this is the definition of a refugee as specified by the United Nations Humanitarian Refugee Committee. So this is what's legally seen to be a refugee. And it's owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, and is outside of his or her nationality or country, and is unable, or owing to such fear is unwilling to avail himself or herself of the protection of that country, or who, not having a nationality and being outside the country of his, her former habitual residence where they normally live, as a result of such events is unable, or owing to such fear is unwilling to return to it. So that's the definition, and that's actually quite strongly adhered to. The four main elements in this definition that we should really take heed of. First is a person must be outside of their country of nationality. So they must have left that country. Right, so where they usually live, or the country where they usually reside, or where they've had their citizenship, nationality, they're meant to be outside of that country, be classified as a refugee. The person must fear persecution of one of those things, like in terms of political, racial, religious persecution. The fear of persecution must be for reasons of race, nationality, religion, or member of a social group or political group, meaning they're very strongly tied to a political philosophy or a social group that's being ostracised. Some of that ostracism could be coming from its ethnicity or its racial component as well, meaning they're nominated like things like the Kurds or some group that's actually got a connotation out there that people recognise. That's usually persecuted. And the fear must be well-founded. So, okay, the definition is trying to very much cover those aspects. What's missing? Is there anything missing out of that definition?
Like an environmental side of it?
There's no environmental impact, climate change, any of those, drought, disaster, famine. There's nothing in that definition. They might be outside their country because of floods or famine or volcano or whatever, but that definition is not saying that. Maybe the political unrest or the war or whatever is caused over fights of resources because of famine and whatever, but it's not actually specified in that definition. So there's 5 types of external compulsions for migration, meaning why people would leave their country. Physical dangers, as I said, floods, volcanoes, whatever, unsafe environment. Usually something to do with economic resources, might been caused through drought or famine or disease or whatever. Religious persecution. Now, religious persecution comes into our UN definition, but those other 2 don't. Ethnic persecution, that comes into our UN definition on race, basically. And ideological persecution actually comes into that definition if we're saying you belong to a social or political group or opinion or attitude. So the latter 3 there do, but the first 2 basically don't. So they might have left their countries of origin. Maybe they've left because, like in Sudan, fighting over scarce resources. But the resources aren't the thing that's going to get you refugee status. It'll be because there's some war or conflict or political unrest. Okay, who is an asylum seeker? An asylum seeker is an individual who is seeking international protection in countries with individualised procedures, meaning countries that actually recognise individuals for asylum seeker status. So asylum seeker is someone whose claim has not yet been finally decided on by the country in which he or she submitted it. So asylum seekers escape from their country, so they're outside their country generally, in another country. They've got to that country some way. They might have come on a legitimate visa, got in as a visitor or a entertainer or something, like Rudolf Nureyev was a very famous one that as a ballet dancer when the company got to London and Paris, he wanted asylum. Not every asylum seeker will ultimately be recognised as a refugee, but every refugee is initially an asylum seeker. And I think this is where the definition gets a bit blurred. Everybody seems to think asylum seekers are refugees or asylum seekers are refugees. But there's only one way about that most refugees would at some stage be an asylum seeker and be granted that status. So asylum seekers, who are the asylum seekers in Australia generally? Yeah, they're called illegal maritime arrivals, if you wonder what IMA is, illegal maritime arrivals, or they come on planes and actually have not the right... Yeah, well, they come on a plane and they might have a visitor visa, which everybody has to have, but then they come here and they'll apply for asylum seekers. Although they'll come illegally through an airport or somewhere, not really with false documentations or papers, if you like. So basically most of the asylum seekers could be classified as our onshore humanitarian migrants. Offshore are generally those being settled by the UN and are coming from another country. They've sought asylum elsewhere. The United Nations then places them in donor countries. So there's this difference. Most of what you read about, unfortunately, in the paper are basically asylum seekers seeking onshore protection within Australia. Our refugees per se are mainly come from other countries that are hosting them, if you like, until they get settled. And there's far too many of them that actually, millions of them that can't all be settled easily or where they want to go. So displaced persons generally, we often just talk without getting down to too many definitions about displaced persons, people not living in their home countries for whatever reason and seeking asylum basically elsewhere. There's been the highest, this is the latest from that website, highest levels of displacement on record, as I just said, 65 million. And there was 21 million refugees. Over half of them are under 18 years of age, very young. 10 million stateless people denied a nationality and right to education, health, employment, wherever they're living. They might have been undocumented migrants into Malaysia or somewhere, but they don't have any rights to health or education or any rights, full stop. They claim 34,000 people are forcibly displaced every day as a result of conflict or persecution. And that conflict persecution definition is your refugee. Remember? Just remember back to that definition, how the United Nations will view it as a legal, if you like, refugee. And they have automatic refugee status. So everyone clear about asylum seekers and refugees, because there's a bit of a blurring there that people don't understand. The media doesn't help you because they sort of classify them all as the same. 54% of the refugees worldwide came from 3 countries, which I found a bit astounding. Somalia, 1.1 million, Afghanistan, 2.7 million, Syria, 4.9 million. And what characterises those 3 countries? War, political persecution, and in the case of Afghanistan and Syria, also ethnic and religious persecution as well. So very much under the definition of those refugees automatically. Where the world's displaced people are being hosted, and these are basically can be your asylum seekers before they get refugee status or refugee settlement. And if we look at Middle East and North Africa and Africa, that's basically 2/3 being displaced, concentrated there. And most settlement by the refugee organisation comes out of Africa and North East Africa. Europe 6%, America's 12%, Asia Pacific only 14%. So this is huge numbers being hosted, if you like, in these countries, which puts pressure on them because most of them are really poor countries, can't cope with their own populations, let alone huge refugee populations. So donor countries like Australia and the UN, other countries, do pay money to help, if you like, in the hosting within these countries. The problem is there's so many, how do they get them resettled in countries? That takes a long time generally, and there's massive amounts. Some Burundi refugees came here a while ago. One of my former PhD students now has a job with the and her job was to bring a group to Adelaide to resettle. And she brought a group, and I got to meet some of them. They had large families, some of them. They had never seen the children, and some of the younger adults too, had never lived outside a refugee camp. So that was their existence. So you can imagine she had to take them to the major, I think she took them to Nairobi first, and they never seen a big city. And then they had to get on a plane, a big flight, come here, and suddenly they're confronted with Adelaide in the winter. So you can just imagine the settlement adjustment of that group of people. One family had 12 children, others, and that's what I'm saying, that your very young age includes all the children of those refugees needing resettlement. The top hosting countries, Jordan, Ethiopia, Iran, Lebanon, Pakistan, and Turkey. Obviously Turkey is hosting a lot from neighbouring countries right at the moment. Okay, Australia as a refugee destination. More than 700,000 basically settled since World War II. It's seen as an important and continuing part of the Australian economy and society. Australia, prime motivation is humanity. Australia has signed UN agreements to take refugees for settlement. Its motivation is humanitarian grounds, and it supplies humanitarian aid directly to some of those host countries as well, in terms of supporting those asylum seekers before they get well, the refugees are usually been assigned as refugees by then for settlement programs. We have an international commitment. We've actually signed the agreements. Some countries haven't, like Indonesia sitting above us, has not signed such an agreement, and it actually plays a role in transit migration into Australia. At first, we'll get to that later, at first the UN wouldn't support any of the transit migration there because they weren't a signatory to the agreements of refugee settlement. So some countries haven't signed. The ones that have signed obviously have obligations. So when people say, let's not take any more migrants, for example, we have one obligation, whatever that cap of migrants is, to take a humanitarian stream. That's an agreement that we basically shouldn't. I guess we could break if we dared, I'm not sure. So offshore settlement, onshore settlement is important. The refugees, subject to persecution in their home country, typically outside their home country, and are in need of resettlement. The majority of those applicants are identified and referred by UNHCR to Australia for resettlement. That category includes refugee, in-country, special humanitarian, emergency rescue and women at risk subclasses within that category. There's also an SHP, which we have to recognise as a special part of the resettlement, and that's the special humanitarian program for people outside their home country, again subject to discrimination, gross violation of human rights, and immediate family of persons who have been granted protection in Australia. So they've been granted protection, or they are refugees in Australia. This category will bring the rest from inside a refugee camp, for example, or whatever. Out of my Burundi refugees I was talking about, there was some just as couples or singles, but the hope was they would be bringing the rest of their family on a special humanitarian protection or program visa afterwards. It's like it's still family unification sort of program that Australia favours generally. A proposer who is an Australian citizen, permanent resident or eligible for New Zealand citizenship or an organisation is based in Australia and must support applications for entry under this program. So it might be an organisation, I don't know, ethnic organisation, another organisation actually supporting people to come in as permanent residents under the humanitarian program. But they still have to meet that definition of a refugee generally, offshore. Onshore protection, 7,000 people already in Australia make applications for protection for refugee status. These include people who arrive lawfully and unlawfully. The people who have arrived unlawfully you hear about, particularly those by sea. There's many that come by air that actually don't have sufficient passports or visas. Well, they can often have, fraudulent documentation, basically. Or we also get people on temporary visas or student visas trying to jump ship and get onto another program. They can have claims for asylum seeker, which can take some time, and they get a permanent protection visa, provided they meet health and character requirements. The permanent protection visa is better than the old temporary protection visas, but the protection visa is entitles them to stay until it's resolved in terms of them becoming permanent settlers, basically. Temporary protection visas abolished in August 2008. This is according to the fact sheet at the time. Why the changes were made: the government was committed to providing fair and certain outcomes for refugees, and abolishing TPVs is considered with government commitment to treating asylum seekers with fairness and dignity. Temporary protection visas were funny things, basically. They think that also caused a huge rise in the number of illegal arrivals, boat arrivals we had in that period, because they could get into Australia and get this temporary protection visa. The only problem is they were in no man's land a bit. They weren't meant to work, they couldn't bring their families. They were sort of left waiting, or just here on temporary protection visas. They were introduced to discourage people smuggling activities resulting from all those boat arrivals, but it seemed to be the opposite. So that's why we went to this system, if you like, of offering permanent protection visas to people who we wanted to treat fairly. A humanitarian program over the last few years, up to 2014-15, someone classified both of these actually offshore. Refugees, roughly 6,000, went up to 11,000 here. This is Gillard actually putting up humanitarian to 20,000 for that year as a cap, but it's sort of fallen back down again to about 13,700. This onshore, 4,000, 7,000, 7,000. Again, these are periods where we were trying to process a lot of boat arrivals in periods, particularly from detention centres. If they finally got their status, they could actually come into these figures. So there was a bit of a lag, and it's dropped back again now to 2,000 odd people onshore. Onshore just means that they were here when they've been granted refugee status. Recent changes to the Act. This comes out of Department of Immigration's Australians Humanitarian Program. If you're interested, discussion paper put up last year. It's closed now, but it was an attempt to get some discussion about the humanitarian refugee caps that we have. A minimum of 13,750 places for 16-17 and 15-16. It's meant to go up to 16,000 again, and 2018-9 up to 18,750, not up to 20 like Gillard did, but clearly they're trying to put it up a bit. That will be the largest intake from overseas in about 30 years, and the recent increase to the offshore component of the program demonstrates the government's commitment to a strong humanitarian intake focus on those most in need of settlement. And what are they saying? It's saying on those most in need of resettlement. Why do you think I think that's important anyway?
Again, focus on the official sort of refugees as opposed to asylum seekers.
Yeah, they were going to, let's say, expand what their obligation was to trying to resettle refugees who are at their maximum number worldwide. So it is recognition of a commitment. The government is trying to say we're going to cut down our arrivals by boat and everything else, and really concentrate on giving these people more share, because those onshore arrivals actually take up some of the cap we can take from elsewhere. There is a cap on it. People argue it's unfair if we increase it too much on the grounds that we won't be able to provide good settlement programs and they won't get a fair deal within the community. I mean, that's another argument I'm not getting into now, but that's one reason. Economically, they say they can't actually do it fairly and give them a chance. I'll just explain this graph because I think it's interesting. These are the 70s here, up to the mid-80s. The blue are refugees, good old refugees as defined in our obligation. The orange or red or whatever it comes out to is a special humanitarian program offering further settlement for people that are already here. It's sort of sponsored settlements from camps, bringing family basically from those camps. You'll see that became special humanitarian by the 90s. It became very important component of that, refugees, bringing other refugees in from certain places. Then we have this green category through here, which was a special assistance category, which obviously became very popular by the mid-90s. Purple, by the way, is onshore. You can see onshore wasn't really a factor in what we were really dealing with up until 95, 96. Then thereafter we can find how the onshore, particularly after this period, has gone up. The red special humanitarian program seemed to cope with some of that, but now we've gone back, obviously, to quite a big component made up of onshore, which is settling people who may have been in detention camps quite some time. They finally get asylum or they've been sent somewhere else. But there's been changes over time. The blue, by the way, is refugees. You can see here that refugees, again, are becoming quite a bit more significant in that intake. We're sort of meeting obligations. So this is just our humanitarian program. We've just really gone through. This is our special humanitarian, this is our refugees. So roughly in the last year, 44% refugees, 36%, so over 3/4 of this has been offshore, only 20% onshore. And that's important. We've had this change back to only a fifth are coming from asylum seekers coming into the country legally or unlegally. But clearly there's other programs also fostering them, bringing them from offshore. Oh, sorry, women at risk, 1,000 visas were granted. The top 5 countries were Afghanistan, Burma, Democratic Republic of Congo, Eritrea and Ethiopia. The humanitarian program over 10 years, onshore, offshore balance. Okay, we've got clearly how this onshore, either the blue is illegal maritime, sorry, the pale blue here is illegal maritime arrivals, boat people if you like. The blue is non, which means they've come by other means or jumping visas of some description. Very big in components, and this is where we've gone back to now. So you can see there's this shift again to actually taking more what we say is defined as a real refugee needing resettlement. And back to that other problem I just asked you about, this is where people argue that some of the ones onshore are queue jumping, meaning they're denying those places for people coming in otherwise. These are top 10 nationalities within the offshore component, and we find Iraq, Myanmar, which is Burma, Afghanistan sort of juggle themselves right across all those years. Bhutan was important, but that seems to have dropped out now. But Syria obviously is become more important in most recent intakes. But again, you've got Eritrea, Somalia, Ethiopia, Iran, not so much now, but clearly that's dropped off as well. Australia's response to the humanitarian crisis in Syria. Government announced a package. This was under Abbott government. Total of 12,000 humanitarian places were made available for people displaced by conflicts in Syria and Iraq. And that's on top of our cap that we normally have. In the humanitarian assistance in the form of food, healthcare, education, emergency supplies and protection extended to people affected in Syria still and Iraq, 44 million, if you like, donation to support those countries. Those 12,000 humanitarian places are in addition assessed as being most vulnerable, women, children and families with the least prospect of ever returning safely to their homes, and they were located in Lebanon, Jordan and Turkey. What I can't find out is exactly how many of them have been successful. It's not in the figures, I can't actually establish that, because there was some problems, because again they still had to meet criteria to actually be able to be allowed in. So how long that processing is going to take, I don't know, but there's no figures and there's no apparent increase on the number of humanitarian arrivals. Anyway, the questions, it's too late now, it's closed, but I think the questions are interesting for you to look at. Sorry. This is what the discussion paper was about. In your view, how many places should Australia attribute to the offshore component of its humanitarian program? Okay, so it's asking the public in a lot of submissions about is it fair? Unfortunately, the public, most of the general public, don't really understand semantics of this anyway. What do you think should be the proportional split between the special humanitarian program and the refugee categories in the offshore component? Because again, there's been arguments that special humanitarian program is a bit out of hand, people being able to nominate back in the home countries was also seen as jumping the queue in sometimes. To which regions, Africa, Asia or Middle East, do you think most places should be allocated? In your view, how important is the Women at Risk program? Again, but some people argue that that needed to be bigger to actually support women at risk. and should the places under the CPP, which is a community protection program, be increased? Okay, so I'm putting it out there, trying to establish exactly what the Australian public wants in terms of refugees. My problem is that media in particular does not get hold of any of these things to actually tell the public exactly. All they ever see is boat people or arrivals or people in detention or whatever, but not the overall program. Okay, as I said, I needed to get my settlement concepts in before I talk about process of settlement. I asked basically assimilation, acculturation, integration and multiculturalism. Multiculturalism as a definition by the Australian government. Australia is made up of people from diverse cultures and backgrounds. Multiculturalism celebrates this diversity and recognises the challenges and opportunities that come with it. So equality between groups, meaning anybody of any minority or otherwise group should have fair, equal rights. Multicultural policy. All Australians have a civic duty to support those basic structures and principles of Australian society which guarantee us our freedom and equality, enable diversity in our society to flourish. Respect for each other, respect subject to the law, all Australians have the right to express their own culture and beliefs and have a reciprocal obligation to respect the rights of others to do the same. Fairness for each person, all Australians are entitled to equality of treatment and opportunity, free from discrimination on the grounds of race, culture, religion, language, location, gender or place of birth. So that's the policy, and that is saying everybody is basically equal, equality of ethnicity, culture, whatever. Differs from assimilation. Newcomers in assimilation policies must give up their distinctive linguistic, cultural or social characteristics, adopt the values and practices of the mainstream receiving society of where they've gone to, and become indistinguishable from the majority population. So that is pure assimilation, that everybody is going to be the same. It devalues the cultures and languages of minority groups and thus contradicts democratic principles of diversity and free choice. The receiving society must offer equality of rights and opportunities to immigrants who assimilate, but it fails where there is discrimination, meaning you can't have both. Acculturation, the process through which immigrants are expected to learn the language of the country of immigration, as well as its presumed dominant cultural values and practices. Problem with the concept, it presupposes that the receiving society is monocultural and that immigrants will give up their own ethnic group cultures. Australia is very diverse, multicultural. We haven't got a monoculture. Anyone remember what Howard did? Australian values test. All people applying for citizenship had to know something about Australian values and the history, which there's a bit of a backlash against that because it was sort of saying everybody must know the Australian. It was like, it was somewhere between them, that you need to understand what Australian values basically are, which is not saying we respect everybody's culture. I don't know if anybody tried to do that test. Is actually on the website if you want to have a look. Integration, people talk about integration. America likes integration, but there's two usages basically. This process through which immigrants and refugees become part of the receiving society, which is fine, assumes a one-way process of adaptation whereby newcomers fit in with the dominant culture and way of life. This usage does not recognise the diversity of culture and social patterns, so it seems to be merely a watered-down form of assimilation. Second usage, two-way process of adaptation involving change in values, norms and behaviour for both newcomers and members of the existing society. Recognises the role of ethnic community and the idea that social and cultural values may change in response to immigration. It's vague and slippery and seems to mean whatever you want it to be. And I reckon that's where Australia basically fits into that second usage of integration. It proclaims multiculturalism and multi-policy, but and I suppose there's a sort of difference between that and what that second usage of integration actually says. And I think we have a two-way process of adaptation. Just look at your eating habits with different cultures, different restaurants. We have, it's been a two-way process. So factors affecting the settlement of and adjustment of migrants. The language obviously important, their skills and qualifications been important, culture's been important, pre-migration experience is important. It's important to know whether it's voluntary or forced migration. They've chosen to come voluntarily or it's forced through refugee settlement or whatever. And the visa type, is it humanitarian or migration program visas? Receiving society characteristics, government policies and practice, to policies relating to is it assimilation or multiculturalism, attitude of society towards immigrants. And obviously that will come from whatever the government policy is, like if it's Japan or somewhere not really wanting foreigners but having to have them and things, there'll be different attitudes to how they actually settle and adjust. I'm just trying to tell you why we went to a more skilled focused program. And one of the reasons was there was a longitudinal survey of immigrants to Australia undertaken by the Bureau of Immigration Research, which was founded in 1989 and renamed Immigration, Multicultural and Population Research in 1996. And unfortunately, not long after that, it found itself abolished when Howard Government Coalition took over. But leading up to that 96 abolishment, there was concern with settlement issues at the time, particularly labour market entry and the qualifications, people not having their qualifications recognised and skill acceptance in Australia. So the government was concerned about that, and they decided on a longitudinal study to see how well people settled and what could be done in terms of policy and settlement experience to improve it. It was inadequate data sources and it was to monitor early settlement experiences. However, that survey excluded persons who were granted a visa, let's say it was just permanent settlers. Permanent arrivals was focused on. And people getting permanent residence in Australia were excluded. There wasn't the big jump from temporary to permanent at that stage. New Zealand citizens who can enter without a visa were settling permanently excluded. And any other visas were not included. And undocumented migrants clearly weren't included. So basically just migration program, including non-humanitarian and humanitarian migrants coming on offshore. It got through two cohorts. Cohort 1, it got through 3 waves. Cohort 2, it sort of lost its impetus. What this graph is basically telling you, the black is when that cohort wave 1 first come. Yeah, there's quite high unemployment rates. Humanitarian, the highest unemployment rate. And then even over time of those 3 waves, they still have the highest unemployment rate. Like there was waves of this survey over 18 months. periods. This is cohort 2, the stripy lines. Cohort 2, yes, all new migrants seem to have higher unemployment, but particularly any humanitarian groups. Okay, so policy implications from a lot of the survey findings from these surveys was the government thought they should improve the selection of immigrants. Skilled migrants were more likely to find work easily. So this is, after 96, 97, where you see those proportion of skilled going up. Need to avoid unemployment and underemployment, which this survey was telling them that was what was happening basically amongst all categories. Facilitation of effective permanent settlement of immigrants, particularly humanitarian migrants, through better provision of post-arrival services. So yes, they did get more, implication was they did provide more settlement services, particularly for those and labour market entry in particular. Assessing the effectiveness of programs and services, and they also wanted to reduce settler loss, which is around 1/5 of much of the post-war period. So that's high. They wanted to just cut down that loss, questioning what was their labour market entry, why do we still have too high unemployment amongst these groups, and reducing prejudice from newcomers, because in those surveys, why the reasons they left was prejudice, disadvantage in getting jobs with same qualifications. There was also a link with poverty through much of the post-war period. New migrants had a greater incidence of poverty than the Australian-born and those of longer-standing immigrant groups. Poverty was greater amongst refugee, family migrants than economic and skilled migrants. Again, here's their justification. Let's put up the skilled quotas and cut down on some of the family and other concessional categories. Poverty amongst immigrant populations was closely related to their ability to enter the labour market. So again, that's what that survey was really interested in, how long it took them, what sort of jobs, and did they have their qualifications recognised. And that's where they've tightened up your independent points assessment test as well, to make sure the qualifications are Australian, if you're a student, but also that you are matching skill needs in the workforce. Increasing emphasis on skill in the immigration program has reduced the incidence of poverty among the recently arrived migrants, excluding the humanitarian entrants. Funny about that, because exactly that's now 2/3 skilled, and it's also targeted to jobs. So what I'm trying to say to you, that big increase in skill came about because they did get some work done and did seriously look at what that problem was, only amongst permanent migrant programs. So in conclusion, the new Australian immigration regime, who are the groups most vulnerable? Because there's still groups out there vulnerable, but it goes straight back on our refugees here, and particularly the places where they're coming from. And some of them are quite skilled, but some of them have been in refugee camps for years and have no actual skills to settle whatsoever, so they need a lot of help. What's been the experience of asylum seekers and refugees with respect to poverty? Interestingly, a lot of the asylum seekers are actually economic migrants. They have better skills and they often have money and whatever behind them. How has this experience differed from those with full refugee status selected offshore and those given onshore status? And there are differences. I know someone doing some work on that now. To what extent is movement out of poverty for humanitarian entrants influenced by their social networks, labour market success, discrimination and country of origin? And clearly there's quite a big discrimination against them having equal access to the labour market. And that was long-term, well, it was found back in that longitudinal survey. What are the implications of Australia expanding the capacity of the humanitarian program? And that's some of the arguments why they won't expand it to say 50,000 like some people want, because then it leaves them as second-class citizens, and it is difficult for them, should I say the word, integrate. So I think that's really what we are talking about here. Okay, so those settlement categories, be aware of what they are. So if you hear me suddenly say integrate, and I shouldn't have said that then, but that's what we do have to say. So it's better they are integrated, because they don't have, some groups don't have as many rights or as many qualifications or as many opportunities to say everybody's equal. They are different. We either protect them, or we have settlement programs that are at least aware that some groups might not be able to have such successful settlement. Okay. Sorry, I knew I had to get through that, and I wanted to get through those funny things I put on the end. But anyway, I have got your essays up if you're interested. And all the essays cover basically what we're doing, have been doing in one form or another, or will do. But